Hi everyone, welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science at Cornell. Today we're talking about sampling for population inference. Often when we make a claim about inequality, we're making a claim about a population, some set of units in a country in a particular time period. And in order to make a credible claim about a population, it's super important that we think very carefully about how we draw a sample of people from that population. So that's going to be our topic today. By the end of class, you'll be able to explain sampling from a population, and you'll also be able to access survey data collected in high-quality probability samples online. I want to actually start with the second point. So a key task we need to accomplish today is to get you access to the Integrated Public Use Microdata Series Current Population Survey. So we'll refer to this as IPMS CPS, and this is a data set gathered by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the U.S. Census Bureau, which is managed through this organization at the University of Minnesota to make it easy to access with clear documentation. So I think you're going to love using IPMS, but in order to use it, you've got to register. So it would be great if you could go to cps.ipms.org, and then in the top corner you'll see this register link. And after you click that, you'll get to a page where you can click to apply for access. And once you apply for access, you give them some information about yourself, like your name and email. It'll ask you for a general research statement, so you can just say something to the effect of, I'm using these data in a class to study socioeconomic inequality in America. It'll ask you for your occupation, so probably you're a student. It'll ask for a detailed version of your occupation, and you can say whatever you think that is. So basically give them some information about yourself. And why this is helpful is that IPMS and the Current Population Survey are funded through federal dollars and through grants. And so it's very helpful for them to know who's using their data and how people are finding it useful. Along the way, you'll also agree not to redistribute the data without permission. And this is also super important, both for protecting the privacy of respondents and also for making sure that anyone who uses the data registers so that we have a good sense of who's been using the data. So if you're watching the video, I would encourage you to pause it and go register for IPMS before you keep going. Next, I want to think, if you were a government agency and you were designing a sample to estimate the unemployment rate, what number of people are unemployed divided by, let's just say, the whole population, then who would you survey? How would you choose who you wanted to go talk to? What mode of data collection would you use? Would you send them a mail survey, call them on the phone, take a survey on the web, knock on their doors? What if people didn't respond? And what would you do in that case? And how would you get a high-quality sample on all these fronts while minimizing costs? So in class, we talked about these questions and got some ideas in small groups and then talked about them as a large group. So if you're watching this on a video form, I'd encourage you to pause and think a little bit about how you'd answer these questions. So in class, we talked about how who you survey really matters. If you just do a survey among people who voluntarily participate in your study, then you might have a sample that's not very representative of the population. For instance, perhaps people who are unemployed have a lot more time, so they're more willing to answer surveys. And then a survey of people who have lots of time on their hands would give you a really bad estimate of the unemployment rate. We also talked about how the mode of data collection matters, where, for example, folks used to answer the phone really well and answer surveys, and over time, phone response rates have really been declining. And we talked about how once you choose someone for your sample, then you really want to get them to respond. So you might first call them and then go follow up in person to make sure you actually got to talk with them. And finally, we talked about how you might combine modes of data collection to try to minimize costs. So these are all considerations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes into account when they design the Current Population Survey to actually estimate the unemployment rate in the US. The CPS begins with a sampling frame, which is all housing units in the US. And sampling frame is a technical term. This is the term for the entire set of people in the population about whom we want to make inference. And every good sample begins with a sampling frame, because only once you've enumerated the set of people you'd like to talk to can you begin thinking about how to get a representative sample of those people. The CPS then divides the sampling frame into 1987 primary sampling units. So a primary sampling unit here is a geographic region, which is often a county or a set of contiguous counties within a state. Then they take these PSUs and they stratify them. So to stratify a sample means to split it up into subgroups so that we guarantee that no matter how we randomly draw our sample, we're going to have some representation from all of those subgroups. So in this case, we might look within a state and find several counties that have similar socioeconomic characteristics. And we might say we want to make sure we get at least one of those counties in the sample. And so the census does this. I say the census because this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics in cooperation with the census. And this way they make sure they have good representation across a variety of counties in each state. So the states have these primary sampling units. Those are divided into strata, and they sample one primary sampling unit per stratum. Then in the next step, within each primary sampling unit, the study samples geographic clusters of housing units. So you could think of this like a little neighborhood, which is super helpful for when field representatives go into the field and actually knock on the doors. The sample is geographically clustered so that they save a lot of time by knocking on several doors in one area. And you can see how there's a cost to this, because across samples, we might have more variance, because we might happen to choose a cluster of houses that say are really high income and like they're all employed, or a cluster of houses that are all low income. And so this is a trade-off between survey quality and survey cost. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics has decided that this cluster geographic sampling is a good balance between those two. So in the end, more than 75,000 households are sampled. And so this is a massive sample that has a huge amount of money going into it, and it's really very high quality data. So to contact the respondents, the BLS works together with the Census Bureau, which is an agency that administers lots of these federal surveys. So the Census Bureau first sends a letter to the selected households informing them that they've been selected for inclusion in the current population survey. Then they call or visit in person, and some evidence suggests that there's really much higher response rates if on the first visit they actually knock on the door and talk to the people to invite them to participate in the first round of data collection. And then importantly, they try many times if needed. So this is really where a lot of the cost comes in collecting a well-designed survey sample, is that some people just don't respond. And we might worry a lot that the thing we're trying to measure is different for the non-respondents than for the respondents. So the Census Bureau is a great agency for following up with people and making sure that they get as high a response rate as possible, and they understand some about the patterns that created non-response. And this is an example of why it's super helpful for us to use data that have already been collected rather than going into the field to collect our own data, because we, or even a big research group at Cornell, would never have the kind of resources that are available to the BLS and the census to conduct a really high quality sample in this regard. And so here in the PDF form of these slides, you can click a link and see a little bit about what this is like for the participants. So they maintain a web page that has frequently asked questions for those who've actually been selected for inclusion in the current population survey. So then what does the survey actually look like? So here's an example from when they are calling them on the phone. The phone interviewer has this script on a computer, and they call and say, "Hello, this is so-and-so from the US Census Bureau. May I speak to," and then they say the name of the respondent. And the whole thing is very structured, where the respondent answers, and then the interviewer will input a number into the computer, and then the computer pops up the next question. So in this case, if they have the right person, they might go through a bunch of questions and eventually get to, "I'm going to ask a few questions about work-related activities. The week before last, or last week, I mean the week beginning on Sunday, a given date, and ending on Saturday, a given date. Did you do any work for pay, either pay or profit?" And so this is a very specific definition of employment, where we can see that the question is framed such that there's a really clear yes or no answer for the respondent. They're really asking them to think about a very particular week. And this is one way that the survey is super well designed, because it leaves less room for participants to interpret the questions in different ways. It's just very clear by the design of the question what concept is being studied. So the current population survey happens every month, but every March there is a much bigger version of the CPS, known as the Annual Social and Economic Supplement. And this is actually the data set that we will use most often in class, because it is an extended survey with lots of extra questions. So for example, it asks questions about annual incomes, which are the variables we've been working with so far in class, and we're going to keep working with now as you begin to work with data where each row represents an individual person's response. The CPS is designed in a series of rotating panels. So suppose a person is sampled for inclusion in the CPS in December. They then participate in the CPS in December, January, February, and March. So that's 4 monthly surveys. And then they have 8 months where they're excluded from the survey. And then they are again included in December, January, February, March of the following year. So one reason for this is to reduce costs. So instead of drawing an entirely new sample every month, there are respondents who already have learned about the CPS and know that they are included, and they just answer the phone and answer the questions the next month. A second reason for doing this is that it provides a new form of data. So if you wanted to ask a question about how economic experiences this year affect economic experiences next year for a given person, you can actually do this using the CPS. Shortly in class, we're going to begin working on independent group projects where you'll be able to ask questions that interest you using the CPS data. And one thing you might do is to construct a CPS panel, which is a little bit tricky to do in code, but can help you answer some new questions about how experiences at one time point are related to outcomes at another time point. So I want to close by saying that the current population survey is only one of many surveys in the federal statistical system. This is a visualization of the main statistical agencies in the government, so they're all centered around the chief statistician of the US, who I believe is based in the Office of Management and Budget under the White House. And outside of here, you can see there are lots of agencies. So in the top right, we have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who collect the current population survey and other labor force data. We have other agencies like the Bureau of Economic Analysis, who summarizes GDP, agencies like the National Center for Education Statistics, who provide data, for example, on college graduates and where they go after college. The National Center for Health Statistics collects information on physicians and hospitals. So many questions you might try to ask about a population have an answer somewhere in the federal statistical system. And the general structure I've just described for the current population survey, where there's a sampling frame, clear selection of individuals in that frame, reaching out to them often by the Census Bureau, and then following up to make sure folks respond, that's a recipe that these agencies generally all follow. So in the federal statistical system, you can find lots of surveys that are of interest for many questions about various aspects of inequality and other aspects of life in a well-defined population. We're accessing these data through the Integrated Public Use Microdata series, which I talked about at the very beginning today. IPUMS is easy to access, has harmonized documentations, it lets you select the variables that you want, and it's really designed to help you compare outcomes over history. So IPUMS historically is largely the work of Stephen Ruggles, who's a historical demographer at the University of Minnesota. And he really wanted to create a data set where you could look at the same variable over time across many federal surveys. And IPUMS has become a terrific resource for doing this and for asking other population-related questions. So the current version of the data are supported by a whole team at the University of Minnesota, and when we use the data, it's really important to give them a site to recognize all the work they've put into making these data available for us. IPUMS is bigger than IPUMS CPS. There's also data from the bigger census and American Community Survey, and there are also data sets on other topics also included in IPUMS, which have very similar data access processes and similar documentation formats. So today, I hope you can now explain to a friend at lunch or on a walk about how sampling from a population works and why sampling from a population is super important. And also, we've taken the first steps to access survey data online, and I'm excited for the future as we begin to dive into these data in our own individual projects. So, looking forward to that.